welcome. Welcome also to the online audience for the hybrid class today. So for any of you who don't know me, Darren Morgan, nursery manager at Shonnard's. I've been doing this for 3 decades plus. Grew up farming too, so it's kind of a thing we do. Do a lot of these classes specifically focused on the vegetable gardening because it's kind of a passion of mine to be able to grow your own. And this is one of those topics that people don't quite get, and for a number of reasons. First of all, off-season gardening, fall and winter gardening, is kind of a little bit of a specialty, and people who have moved from elsewhere don't necessarily have the same experiences. Like, you don't do the kind of fall and winter gardening in the Midwest or even the Northeast that we do here. It's a really different game. Same thing, it's very different if you're out of the Southwest. It's not the same thing at all. So we do, of course, we're in an area where we get a lot of people that have moved in from other areas. So it's kind of a different topic. So what we're going to be talking about today is planting for fall and winter gardening with a focus here on the Willamette Valley in Western Oregon. And hopefully we'll give you some insight, and some of it's much easier than you think, and some of it can be a little complicated, but there's some little tricks and tips that will make this manageable instead of a frustrating challenge. So when we talk about the fall and winter garden, it's actually kind of 3 gardens. There's a fall harvest garden. A lot of these are main sequence crops. These are things you plant in April, May. You grow a garden through the summer for fall harvest, or you plant at the very tail end of the main planting season in May to June, but they're grown over the main season primarily. You're simply harvesting in the fall. We also have a limited panoply of winter harvest crops, and these are crops that you can actually take out of the garden and utilize through the winter, some of them more so than others. And lastly, it's the overwintered garden. Quite a number of crops can grow over the winter for harvest either in the spring, in the case of leaf and cole crops, usually finishing up sometime in March, or the following summer for very long duration overwintered crops. And so one of the big things about this from my standpoint is I pretty much live out of my vegetable garden. Yes, we buy groceries. We're not poor. We can buy groceries. But we do, the vast majority of the vegetation we eat does come out of my vegetable garden. It's a little under 2,000 square feet worth of vegetable garden. So it's a big garden for an urban model. There is a distinct dearth period, and it's not necessarily what you think. It's not winter, because we still got some things that are late fall harvest and into early winter harvest, and they're fine. And it's the spring. It's February, it's March. You have nothing left of the winter garden in there. You've got only things that have resumed growing potentially. You have very little of what you've stored unless you did a really bang up job of freezing and canning. You're starting to run out of things, and nothing that you plant, the few things you can plant as early as January and February won't be ready yet in February and March. So having some of these specialty crops available right in that season goes a long way towards improving our ability to stay living out of our garden instead of getting the grocery stores. So what types of crops are we talking about? Well, the dominant fall crops are, of course, root crops, beets, carrots, and some overwintered crops like onions. Whole crops, that's what most people think of as fall vegetables, broccoli, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts. A number of leaf crops. The volume of leaf crops available for fall, winter, and overwinter gardening far dwarfs the other 2 categories put together. And then legumes, though legumes are kind of a narrow specialty. There's only a few things you can do, and they don't always quite work out, so they're not for the faint-hearted. So root crops are excellent crops to grow. They should be in every pantry. You should grow them. Every gardener should grow them. They kind of have a mystique about them as being a bit more challenging, and some of them can be. But once you get it down, they're extremely valuable because they're space efficient. The volume of food produced per square foot on root crops is tremendous compared to most other crops. Most root crops also store post-harvest very well. So you don't have to go through a lot of involved freezing and canning. You can root cellar them, or you can throw them in the vegetable drawer of your refrigerator and have a long sustained availability of the crops you've grown. The vast majority of root crops are done for fall or winter harvest and fare quite well in that season. There's certainly the ability to grow some of these root crops in the main season. So don't think you can't. But the fall season really is the fall harvest season and forward is really the primary growing season for them. There are a few of those. Most notably, we're talking about things like garlic and onions that are really only effectively grown as overwintered crops. These are things you always plant in the fall and you always plant the following summer. It's just inherent in their nature. And we'll talk in a bit more detail about those. So what are our root crops in the fall and winter garden? Beets are an easy one to work with. Of course, they can be grown through the main season as well. If you plant from seed now in early June, you're looking at basically a fall harvest, an August-September harvest. You have some options to seed them either later in the season or in sequential batches, so you have different harvest times. But once you get past maybe the last week of July or first week of August, you start having problems getting your beets big enough by the time the weather gets too bad for them to continue growing. So you get either little beets or no beets at all. We talk about root crops in the fall and winter garden. We have to talk about the ability to ground store them. In other words, how long, once they're technically ready, where you could harvest them, can you simply just leave them in the ground and pick them as you need? Beets in general hold up medium well as a ground store crop. They do tend to decline as we get later into the wet and coldest parts of the winter. And they are subject to a number of insect pests if you have a lot of soil insects. But generally speaking, they're a crop that even if it's ready for harvest in October, you can pick a few at a time and leave the rest in the ground and simply come back to them into November, even into December. So they hold medium well. I mentioned insects, and insects both above ground and below ground are a kind of a significant problem with beets. Beets are subject to several soil insects that burrow into the tuber. If you have a lot of soil insect problems, this is often a historical thing with experience, you might consider doing pre-plant treatments with either nematodes for biological control or with a synthetic pyrethroid like bifenthrin as a soil insecticide prior to planting. In my garden at home, I've been gardening it for 20 some years in that same spot. I really don't have a lot of that issue, sporadic, but it does come up. More commonly, we worry about beets and leaf miners. Like all the chenopod's, they get bugs that lay their eggs between the layers of leaf, and then they tunnel through, leaving these hollow shriveling spaces in the leaf. And while that's not as frustrating on beets as it is on crops that you're eating the leaves on, which of course you can on beets as well, it still impacts your yield and your productivity pretty significantly. So we'll talk a bit more about specific insect controls later in the talk, but you are going to need to provide insect controls, and more so the later into the summer you're planting, because when you're planting in April or May, insect populations are pretty low. When you're planting in July, insect populations are near the peak they will be for the year, so you tend to have more problems overall. A funny note on curiosity on beets. When you plant a beet seed, it's not a seed, it's a drupe, it's a dried fruit. It has multiple seeds inside of it. For every seed you plant, you get 4 or 6 or so beet plants coming up. Thinning is essential. It is not optional on beets. If you do not thin them pretty aggressively, starting at about 3 true leaves and following through for another week or so after, you won't get any beets. You'll just get some leaves because they don't have space to expand. So ultimately, you want to be thinning those down to about 4 to 6 inch spacing between individual beet plants as you go. And eat those thinnings, the greens, especially in the second and third thinnings, when you've got some leaf size to them. They're really nice little additions to a salad. Radishes are also a widely used crop in the main season. They are usually planted from seed. They don't transplant well. Beets, by the way, you can transplant. You just need to do it really early in the growing cycle before the taproot gets too deep. I've gone to doing that with beets quite a bit just because it's easier to thin that way. They don't get out there and do it enough. Radishes don't have that problem. Radishes grow really fast. So radishes in peak of season, say in May and June plantings, go from seed to harvest in about 3 to 4 weeks. So that kind of speed. So ideally with radishes, because let's be honest, how many radishes are you going to eat? So very small batches of radishes every 2 or 3 weeks, starting in the spring and continuing all the way into September, even through September. Both shoulders of the season, both the really earlier plantings and the really later plantings, grow slower. You do need to keep that in mind. That's something we're going to talk about also a little bit later. But if you look at a 21-day radish, planted according to the package, you plant that in August, you're talking about 30 to 36 days easy. It takes quite a bit longer. We'll talk about the whys in a bit. So radishes grow fast enough and well enough into cool weather, as long as you get enough soil temperature for seed germination, that they can be quite a persistent crop. They typically freeze out somewhere in the upper teens, right around 20 degrees. So you have an extended period here. If your last batch seeded late September is likely to finish by the end of October, but you might freeze out the very latest plantings if you go that late. Watering radishes in the early part of the season is a critical feature. Okay, beets have this to a lesser degree. You can't ever let your radishes really get dried out, and that's sometimes hard during the hottest parts of the summer in late July and early August in particular. So you do need to maintain a consistency of watering, or they get hot and they stay smaller. Consistency of watering matters. Beets have a little different issue on that. They have a very modest water requirement during the end of their cycle, but in the middle part of their season, right around days, roughly around 30 days post planting, they're relatively thirsty. So make sure you're keeping an extra eye on them in that period. And again, not getting dried out. That's when the tap is beginning to transition. So of course, leaf miner is the problem in beets, but radishes get beetles, flea beetles in particular. Keep an eye out for holes in the leaves, and when you start seeing any insect damage on radishes, treat with an organic insecticide. I use neem. It's pretty bee safe and very effective on a wide variety of insects. Carrots also often done as a main season crop. If you plant roughly end of June through maybe early mid-July, you're talking about a distinctively late summer to fall harvest. If you push that back from mid-July through maybe early part of August, you're talking about quite a late fall harvest, definitely October, November harvests. They are annoying to germinate. And the later you do it in the season, the worse this problem is. So carrots take about, on average, 21 days just to germinate the seed. So the time you put a radish crop in and you're harvesting radishes, your very first sprouts are beginning to come up on your carrots. So my problem is I'm an impatient gardener. So as I'm hitting down there about day 17, 18, seed of carrots, I better put some more seed out. And about the time I finally get out there and start throwing some seed around, I was like, wait a minute, that's a carrot coming up. Some other ways you can avoid some of that frustration. Plant your carrot patch and plant a crop of radishes right on top of it. Okay, so the radishes will be up, harvestable, and gone by the time your carrot seeds are really germinating, and they will tend to displace and disturb some of the seeds. Of course, carrots, you see them very dense and thin aggressively. So they'll kind of help you with that first thinning, getting your spaces in there. And it's a good way to make some double use of the same space. You can transplant carrots in theory. The little orb types, the little round ones, do much better than any of the tappers. my experience with carrots is transplanting them is not worth the effort. Just take your lumps in seeding and thinning, and don't try to transplant them. The risks are pretty high. We talk about seeding for a fall to winter harvest. There are varieties of carrots, specifically Merida and Autumn King. There's some others out there. Those are the ones you're likely to see. And Merida and Autumn King are overwintering carrots. So you plant them later. You plant them in maybe mid to late September from seed. They hardly do anything over the winter, so rope it off and keep it weeded, because they will surprise you. All of a sudden you get out there in February and say, I got carrots coming up. Yes, that was the idea. And then they'll come up and develop out in February, and by April or so, you'll be eating carrots by the time you're ready to replant your next batch if you're doing main season carrots. Okay. Yes, question?
Do we get enough rain around here that it would carry water them through? Or
did we get enough rain to carry your carrots through? So we get enough rain fall and winter that once the rains come in October, you're done watering for the year. But you're going to be watering those carrots. If you're planting in July, you're going to be watering those carrots twice a day to keep them germinating.
I meant like the overwinter one.
Yes.
So I can basically feed it and then just let it.
Yeah. Right. For the overwintering carrots, you seed late, as close to the rains as you can get. You don't even worry about more than just a basic watering in. The rains themselves that come in the fall will keep it germinating consistently wet enough for the development through the winter. So yeah, I like easy gardening too. Yeah, it's a good thing.
So give me that fall planting date. So
fall planting dates would be maybe mid-September through early October for overwintering. Merida's listing as I think 240 from that cycle. Autumn King's a little faster, 180 or 220 or something like that. Again, these are nominal days, so you can figure it roughly April harvest from those dates approximately, and it's always a little variable on how good a crop we get off of that, but it's still fun, and there's some of the sweetest carrots you'll ever taste. Now, most carrots, if you planted late and you did that, they either wouldn't develop at all, or they develop these really spindly, twisty, hairy carrots that aren't normal. Yeah. Yes, so that's it. Variety matters in this case. Other than that, varieties for fall harvest really it more fits your taste and your soils. I do a lot of Danvers because of my heavy soils, short, fat carrots that tolerate my heavy clay. Certainly, other options out there for fall harvest. So insects. The issue here is carrot rust fly. Well, they hardly have any other significant problems. Occasional slug damage on the tuber, occasional wireworm damage on the root itself. But our big problem is carrot rust fly maggots. So this isn't a problem when you plant your carrots in April for harvest in the summer, because there's just not enough rust flies out at that point in time to be an issue. But when you're planting in July or August, there's a lot of carrot rust fly out there. And best bet for that is to get your seed out, and the moment you start seeing germination, usually 18 to 21, but sometimes for me 24 or 25 days after seeding, you throw an insect barrier. So insect barrier, this is like a remay fabric or a plant blanket, but it's lighter weight. It doesn't trap as much heat, and it's designed specifically just to keep insects out of a crop. And so you throw an insect barrier over that planting, which means putting a few sticks up, because those carrots are so small at that point, even the weight of the insect barrier is a little excessive. A few sticks up to keep it propped on, a couple of weights. I use clods or rocks, just weight down the edges of the fabric, and just leave it there until your carrots are about 4 inches tall. And at that point in time, they're no longer attractive to carrot rust fly maggot. So it's a small fly, and it comes in, it lays its egg on the soil immediately adjacent to the sprouting seed. And then that larva, when it hatches out, tunnels right down into the developing taproot. And that's why they're such a disastrous problem. Parsnips. Now, you either love parsnips or you don't. I don't love parsnips, so I don't spend a lot of time growing them. But in principle, they are one of the most successful late harvest root crops out there. Parsnips, you need to be on your planting game. Most people actually do their parsnips as part of their main sequence plantings in late May or early June for harvest fall to winter, because it takes that long. It's over 100 days. You can plant as late as maybe mid-July and still manage a crop. And that's about as late as I would even take a chance. And parsnips do not transplant worth a darn in my experience. So they ground store better than just about any other root crop out there. And it's real common for these later seedings to be out there picking your parsnips in December or even January, making one of the few crops in the garden you can harvest in January in the depths of winter. It is a carrot family or parsley family member. Like all of them, it is obnoxiously slow to germinate. It's, if anything, even worse than carrots. So have patience during the establishment phases and keep it consistently moist while it's germinating. Like carrots, they get carrot rust fly maggot. So as those sprouts are emerging, do blanket them for insect control. So carrots and parsnips are very close related. They have a lot of things in common. They really hate crusty soil during their germination phases, and they like their soil to be deep, but not particularly rich in terms of organic mass, or you get forky or hairy carrots, or forky or hairy parsnips. So do a good job of site prepping a very deep site. Parsnips will be rooting down at 12, 15 inches. So you really need 15 to 18 inches of available soil under them. Do a good job of amending that soil, but don't go too heavy on the composts. So if you've got a really rough clay, some compost will be essential, but I will often incorporate some sandy loam as part of that as well. So you have more of a mineral soil and less compost, less organic mass in there. Really aged compost where it looks like dirt is usually fine. It's the decompositional cycle that affects the tubers.
What's it the
really old compost that really has broken down where it doesn't look like even compost anymore, it looks like dirt, is usually fine for incorporating into them, because that does not have as much negative impact on them. So I like to scatter seed on the surface rather than trying to dig them in at all. And then I take, again, a sandy loam or a potting soil, but not a compost. And I just put a very thin coat right over the top of the seed, usually around 1/8 of an inch over the top of the seed. So just a hand scatter it along, barely coating the seed. It'll trap some moisture against the seed and keep a few of the birds off during the germination cycle. But trying to actually put a furrow in and plant them at 1/8 to 1/4 inch does not work well for me. I end up either too deep or not getting them in any kind of a consistent pattern. It's also fun with kids, you get out there and say, and most of them, it's planting in the garden. It's like, well, no, this is kind of precise, but you get the 4-year-olds and 5-year-olds, create your little patch for your carrots, get it all prepped, and say, give them a handful of carrot seeds, just toss it out here, and then they can watch it develop up. So garlic and onions are often the introduction to overwinter gardening for the most gardeners, because it's really the only way to grow these crops effectively. Garlic is pretty dialed in. Yes, there are other ways to do it, but it's almost always consistently the same thing. You have garlic cloves that are certified seed garlic, so we know they're disease-free and we know they're a given clonal generation, so they're not different from the name they're being sold under. We plant them as early as possible in the fall for best results, but September, maybe even as late as February, you could still put garlic out and get garlic, though your yields won't be great. Garlic and onions are day length regulated plants rather than number of days in the ground regulated plants. So regardless of when you plant them, your garlic is going to be ready maybe mid to late June through early July, depending on variety and exact conditions in the garden. So this is why planting them earlier gives you better results. They got more time growing in the ground. You can plant in February, but you get little ones because they have less time in the ground. It's just that simple. Basically, garlic's one of the easiest overwintering crops to do. You do a basic soil prep. You separate out the individual cloves from the bulb. You plant them around 4 or 5 inches apart, around 3 inches deep, and they grow. And you can feed them and you can water them, get them established. It's always a good idea. And you can do all kinds of fancy feeding tricks to make them grow bigger and better through the season. But even if you don't do any of that, you're going to get garlic at the end. It's going to be a question of how much garlic and how good a quality. So we like this as an introductory crop to the winter gardening. So if you're planting September through early October, do an organic fertilizer, granular fertilizer, like a vegetable food, like normal, like you would for most vegetable plants at planting. And they're going to come up and they're going to start growing right after planting. As we get later into the fall, maybe late October, early November, and you've got these little baby garlic plants up, it's a good idea to see if we can get just a little more growth out of them before they go into winter. But they're not going to pick up a granular organic fertilizer well. They're not feeding well from the soil at all, and soil biology is really slow in that window of time. So the nutrients aren't becoming available to the plants. So I use a liquid organic on them, usually sometime late October, early November, right around Halloween. Then you just kind of leave them be, keep the weeds out of them, because weeds impinging upon their space will result in less yields again. All through the winter. And about February, you'll really, maybe mid to late February, you really notice, wow, they're really growing again. You can actually see the growth developing again. Again, soil temperatures are pretty low. So I'll go out and throw another dose of liquid organic fertilizer on them at that point. Mid-March, I'll throw a last dose of organic granular fertilizer to side dress down the rows and lightly incorporate it in with my hand. And then they will get really nice big garlic for harvest June to July. Weed control is not optional. We have a lot of weeds in Western Oregon that think fall is spring because it's our weather pattern. So it's the way your lawn grass works if you don't water it. When rains come in, things start growing. They grow through the wet season because we're not all that cold, and then they go dormant, they etenate, they go dormant for the summer season because it's too dry for things to grow. So that's kind of the pattern you're seeing here, and we're mimicking in a lot of crop plants, but that's also what happens with your weeds. So it's very important with any of these fall, winter, and overwintering crops to pay attention to the weeds developing and try to keep them under control so they're not overwhelming. Thing with garlic that happens, that is an easy correction if you're paying attention to it. We like to give them some water if we're really dry in April or really dry in May. It's okay. You don't want to get your soil cracked out dry around them. It inhibits, again, the tuber formation. But once we're getting close to harvest, we want them to get dry and to develop their sheets of paper over the bulbs that will enable them to cure properly and store well. So we'll see the process happening usually about late May or early June. You'll start seeing the leaves yellowing despite any amount of moisture, despite any amount of fertilization. You just start the beginnings of the progression of the yellowing of the leaves. Stop watering them. That's usually about 3 to 4 weeks ahead of harvest, and give them a chance to really finish off well and store well. Onions are similar, but you have more options in onions, more different ways you can do it right. If you're doing onions from, well, sorry, onions are still day length regulated, just like garlic. Don't do short day onions here. That's the south thing. That's south of the Mason-Dixon line. You do that. They don't develop right here because our weather patterns don't match their growing patterns. Okay. Do long day onions. We do Walla Walla sweets, for example. Intermediate day onions are fine. What they call day neutral onions are fine. If you're going to do them from seed, your best time to do them from seed is roughly the middle of July. You might go all the way through early to mid-August and still have good results. It is a bit of a pain to germinate onion seeds. They're really sensitive to drying out, more so than even most of the other seed crops we talk about. So it's very common for people who are seeding onions to instead start them inside in trays and 6-packs and then transplant them out because it's easier to maintain that moisture. But you can certainly direct sow if you're really good on your watering. The whole panoply of varieties are usually available from seed for planted that season. Okay. The second option for onions is to plant them as sets. These are hard bulbs. You plant them usually, again, you plant them from roughly September through roughly February or March and still get onions. But the earlier you do that, the bigger your onions are likely to be. So they've got longer time in the ground. Now, one of the things that happens when you grow an onion plant on as a biennial and you let it harden off as a bulb and you harvest it and you sell it, is that there's a stress factor that goes in there. And sometimes these sets have an alarming tendency to bolt, to throw flowers, okay, more so than other ways of growing onions. That's just response to stress. So bolting in garlic is normal and doesn't hurt the garlic. Bolting in onions reduces their value in terms of their productivity, and it also really limits their ability to store, because with garlic, you've got the flower that goes down and the bulbs are all around that flower, which the flower stem goes down to the root mass. With onion, the flower stem goes right through the middle of the onion. And so when that flower stem develops, it doesn't dry off and cure like the leaf tops do. And so you have this green core going down through the middle of your onion that never quite cures. So that's why we avoid it. So anything that bolts in your onions, just harvest it out, use it in short term. Don't try to store it, and you'll be fine. You're gonna have a reduced yield. But this is really common with set onions. I get about 50% of my onions from set are bolting out there right now. So this kind of goes with the territory. The third way to go onions isn't really germane to our talk today, but it's to get finished green bunches in February or March and plant them like that. So that's where somebody commercially has started onions from seed, has grown them up to that point, and then they dig them in January, February, and they box them and they ship them. So it's just like you did it yourself from seed, except somebody did it commercially for you. That's a really great way to handle onions. And if you're getting behind on your fall winter crop, don't despair. You do have that option out there. Garlic and onions are surprisingly hungry for the type of plant. You look at them and they're not really big, and they don't have a lot of greens. They really like a lot of nitrogen. Have the ability to put on lots of green growth will determine how big their tubers are later in the season. So you really need to feed them pretty substantially well. With onions, I typically follow the garlic pattern. Granular fertilizer at planting, liquid feed late fall, liquid feed early spring, granular feed again mid-spring. And like garlic, they do better if you cut off the water about 2 to 3 weeks ahead of harvest. Unlike garlic, if you don't water them, you can just leave those onions in the ground and pick them as you need them through the summer, fall. Yeah. Garlic, if you do that, the cloves deteriorate, the casings deteriorate, the cloves fall apart, and then you're never able to harvest them out correctly. You'll get a few cloves, but you'll leave a lot behind in the ground. Yes, question?
Maybe it's gonna fly, but can you treat shallots the same way?
Yeah, so I tried to cut this down because I know we're already going to be way over the available time. Shallots are basically the same as onions and garlic. They're day-length regulated crop that's planted from a bulb in the fall, ideally. You can also do them as a bulb in the early spring with diminished harvest results. Shallots are pickier than garlic or onions by a substantial measure. It's one of the reasons they're so expensive. Plant them shallow. Shallots shallow, easy to remember. So if I'm planting garlic down at 4 to 6 inches, well, 3 to 4 inches in my garden, and I'm planting onions down at maybe 1 to 2 inches subsoil, shallots, I plant them with the tip basically visible or just barely under the soil surface, because they're much pickier about the winter moisture. They're also similarly hungry plants. Leeks are the other one I really kind of cut out of the talk because I just don't have enough people doing it, but they're handled very much different. They're a spring planted crop for fall to winter harvest that you don't normally overwinter them, though you can. So rutabagas and turnips. So rutabagas and turnips are essentially basically the same plant, but turnips, you don't want to get them really big. Their best quality is somewhere around 4 or 5 inches of bulb size, which means they're a relatively quick turnover crop for a root crop. If you plant them by seed in July or August, you'll be harvesting them in September, October, maybe into November. Okay. And that's really the best way to handle them, is to get them out early. Do not try to ground store them as well. Insects, cold, and moisture really impact their ability to ground store. You can theoretically transplant turnips. Because they're such a relatively short turnover crop, I seldom bother. They are a brassica. We'll talk a little bit more about crop families here later, but that means they get all the brassica insect pests. They get root maggots, they get aphids horribly. So you do need to pay really close attention to insect control. It means regular inspection, getting out there and looking at what's actually happening. Okay. Like all brassicas, they're nitrogen hogs. Even though they're a root crop, feed them plenty of fertilizer. Usually, though, unlike talk about the garlic and onions with repeat feedings. You just do a really substantial feeding at planting and you'll get through fine. Rutabagas are kind of the same thing, except that you want to get them bigger. A good rutabaga is 6 or 7 inches. So they're still have good eating quality in that size range, which means you either start them earlier, June, or you harvest them later. They're a little denser than turnips, a little less subject to some of the depredations, and definitely a little more cold hardy than turnips. So they ground store better. Rutabagas are really common for me to be harvesting in December instead of in October, November. Rutabagas take long enough and are difficult enough with insect pests that I often transplant and seed both. I'll do a mixed bed with some transplants in and then some seed in between the transplants. You just need to get the transplants in when they're very young before they develop much depth to the root system, so you have a chance to develop them now. Aphids have been my bane of growing rutabagas. I get a good planting going out there in July, and by September, they're wall-to-wall aphids. I'm culling 30 or 40% of the plants because they're so aphidy, it's not worth spraying anymore. So pay attention earlier in the season, get those aphids before they get that bad, and you'll be much happier with your rutabaga and turnip crops.
And what do you use?
I use neem. Neem insecticide is good general purpose insecticide. You can use it on aphids, you can use it on caterpillars, you can use it on beetles. It has a limited duration on the leaf. So, you know, they'll stick there and give you insect control for maybe 3 or 4 days post application, but safe enough that you can use it up to the day before harvest with no problem. Just if you're really pushing the envelope, make sure you wash those vegetables. Neem is notorious. It's not particularly dangerous to you, but it's notoriously bitter. And if you've neemed a day or two and then you harvest and you don't wash, you'll taste it. You'll notice. Okay, so be aware of that. But it's one of the more be-safe options out there in terms of insecticides. There's a lot of other organic insecticides, and soaps work fine for aphids. Even streams of water can knock enough aphids off sometimes to make a difference. Usually, by the time I see aphids in my garden, it's past the stream of water. It's at least up to soap level. The problem with soaps is they only control what you get, have no residual control. So if you're out there every day spraying what you see, it's effective. But if you go a week sometimes between getting out and spraying, then they're not going to give you as good a control. Fall crops. So this is probably the best known fall and winter crops. So your broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage, Brussels sprouts, all of those. For most of these are different varieties have very different number of days to harvest. So typically your planting season for all of these is about the same. And then depending on the variety you plant, you might be harvesting those in the fall or in the winter or overwintered for spring. And if you like variety, you plant a variety of different ones and you do it that way. Basically hardy, but some varieties need cold protection at certain stages of growth, and that's worth we'll hit that in a couple of slides here, but it's worth paying attention to because they are a mixed bag in terms of overall winter hardiness. One of the neat things about the pole crops is there are things in there that you're harvesting in January. There's things in there you're harvesting in February. These fill in the gap in the slowest part of the vegetable season very, very effectively. So basic pole crops for fall and winter gardening: Brussels sprouts. If you haven't done your Brussels sprouts from seed yet, you're too late. I recommend in general with pole crops transplanting. A number of them can be direct seeded, but the success rate is low enough. You're much ahead. Either start your own transplants 4 to 5 weeks ahead of these dates, or buy transplants. It's definitely worth it. So if you're transplanting now, you're right about on schedule for Brussels sprouts. You have a window that runs through maybe 4th of July to get them in and have good production. A little later, yeah, I've done them as late as mid-July and had decent crops. Best flavor on your Brussels sprouts is after we've had some substantially cold weather. So if you're getting them developing up, I tend to let them stand and harvest out October-ish, late October, early November, or later. And they will hold in the garden amazingly well. There's some interesting fun ones you can play with too, besides the traditionals, because I frankly get a little bored with traditional Brussels sprouts. Calettes, it's a Brussels sprouts kale cross. And so you get a Brussels sprouts like plant with all these little baby balls of kale all along the stem instead of these cabbagey balls all along the stem. It's a little milder, sweeter flavor as well. All kinds of fun things to do, but all of them have one thing in common. Aphids are a disaster on them. It's very, very hard to keep the aphids under control on your Brussels sprouts. And they don't just attack the leaves, they get down into the sprouts and into the creases. And it's really, really hard. So you can try insect barriers. Again, insect barriers go a long way to reducing the amount of aphids coming in. Obviously, once you've got aphids in, they're not any good. Regular inspection for control during the late summer and fall before you're really into thinking about harvest will help. Lastly, encourage your bird population. So I find sparrows annoying because they do tatter things really bad in the garden. They go through and eat a lot of leaf mass. But in the course of that, they're eating a lot of bugs. And I have a lot less insect problems when I'm feeding sparrows than when I'm not feeding sparrows. So keep that in mind as well. I have noted that particularly with calettes and to a lesser extent with Brussels sprouts, delaying the harvest until really late in the year does reduce some of the insect pressure on them too. You have to sacrifice some, the ones that already got hit pretty hard earlier in the season, but those later ones that are forming up quite late in the season, probably aphids are still active through the winter. They're not very mobile through the winter. So the younger sprouts that have come on later in the season tend to have much less problem. Cabbage is a great crop. Once you figure out what you're going to do with it consumption-wise, it holds really well post-harvest. There are a number of things you can do for preserving it, but it's a crop that's going to be limited by your consumption rate, really. Different varieties harvest at very different times. So if you can plant a mixture of varieties all at the same time, you could have cabbage that you're harvesting in October, November. You can have cabbage you're harvesting December, January, and you can have cabbage you're harvesting February, March, all from one planting, just different varieties. Typical transplanting is right now, June through early July. You can run it as late as late July. You might impact your size a little bit, depends on how good a fall we have. I tend to try to be done with most of my coal crop plantings by the middle of July. I find that going into late July it gets a little chancy. Cabbages are less prone to insects than a lot of coal crops, but they still get them. They get aphids. They're quite prone to slug damage, and that's worth controlling early. Certified organic slug baits like Sluggo, iron phosphate baits, they're pet safe. They're safe, they're pretty darn effective even in the wet parts of the season. So broccoli is a little different. We talk about cabbage and we'll talk about cauliflower in a minute, and there's fall harvest, winter harvest, overwintering, and they're all basically the same plants, really. I mean, they behave the same. Broccoli is different. You don't really have a winter harvest brock. You have fall harvest brock, and fall harvest brock is like spring harvest brock. It's big, typically a big central head. If you leave them in the ground, you might get some sprouting the next spring, some secondary sprouts. That works for me pretty regularly. Overwintering broccoli is completely different. Overwintering broccoli is sprouting broccoli. So you never get a big head. Instead, you get a tall, branchy plant with a whole batch of little heads about an inch or inch and a half across. They typically mature late February through maybe late March before they start flowering out. I had some still going in April this year, which was a real boon. We had that nice, cool, wet spring, and it kept them going. You just keep clipping them, and they keep resprouting. You keep clipping them, and you keep resprouting until finally they're flowering. When they're, you know, the size of a dime, they're already opening flowers, and you know it's over. Pull the plant out with that. But it's noticeably different. It's typically the common one you see is purple sprouting, but there are green sprouting varieties as well. But they're just different. Don't expect that head formation. You still plant your fall harvest brock and your overwintering broccoli roughly the same time. You have a little more leeway in the overwintering. You can get them in a little bit later. Do feed your broccoli up really well, because they need to hit head maturation size or robust enough plants to have enough stored energy to make it through the winter before we get really cold in late October, early November. So fertilize well at planting. If they look like they're not moving along fast enough, supplement with some of the liquid organics. It's a great idea. You often don't need to, but you can if you need to push them along. But don't let them stay little puny things going into fall, or you're not going to be happy with the results. So cauliflower is more like cabbage. You've got different varieties that harvest at different times from the same plantings. Your planting window goes basically from now through about end of July, first part of August. Again, I like to get them in a little on the front end of that if at all possible. Different varieties have different maturation periods: October, November, December, January, or February, March. Fertilize well, get the size onto them. Both broccoli and cauliflower are immensely prone to root maggots from summer plantings. It's not a problem you have when you plant them in April for spring and summer harvest. But if you're planting them in June and July for fall and winter harvest, the root maggots are a problem. It's just like a carrot rust fly maggot. There's a fly that lays its eggs in the larva, but they take it a little bigger, usually not right at germination, usually as the plants are just getting decent sized, a couple of inches. They lay their egg, the larva goes down into the root system and eats all the roots. So well worth using, again, an insect barrier at planting until those plants are 6 inches higher. So 4 to 6 inches high, and that's big enough usually to avoid this particular problem. Aphids are a chronic problem on any fall crop. They're a disaster on broccoli. I usually manage a little bit better on cauliflower, but keep them inspected young so you don't have an aphid population going heavily into the fall, and you'll be much happier with your results. Now, broccoli and Brussels and cabbage in Western Oregon do not need protection. We are mild enough, even on our colder winters, that you don't really have to give them winter protection. You can. I find that winter protecting them tends to give me a little bit more slug problems than I like, but other than that, it's certainly an option. It can reduce some of the stressors on them, giving maybe a little bit bigger yield. Cauliflower, it's not optional. Fall harvest cauliflower, you don't need to worry about winter protection. If you have cauliflower that is intended for harvest in January, February, or March, you need to protect them. They start taking damage somewhere in the mid-teens on the plant, and somewhere in the mid-20s on the flower bud, which is the part you're going to eat. So it's really easy to freeze out the actual cauliflower part of the cauliflower. So protect them. So leaf crops, there's a multitude of leaf crops to play with. The neat thing about leaf crops is they really are the thing that gives you the most options for harvest through the winter and overwintered into spring. A number of them are also fall harvest varieties. Most of them will need at least some degree of cold protection if you're intending to overwinter them or winter harvest them rather than just do them as fall crops. And the ability to have anything overwinter and produce in the spring is great. And there's two different categories of these overwintering. There's the marginal overwinterers, the ones that just don't develop well during the winter, but are strong enough to make it through and then push growth late, like spinach. There are the biennials, like chard and kale, that simply keep going and going and going until they've completed a life cycle and flower. So arugula. Arugula is a mustard or a brassica, so keep that in mind. We talk about plant families. You have an incredible opportunity to work with arugula. You can be planting arugula now and you'll be harvesting in the summer. You can plant arugula in July and you'll be harvesting in the fall. You can plant arugula in September and you'll be harvesting midwinter, roughly, if protected. Best bet is to plant small batches repeatedly. Small, maybe it doesn't need to be as small maybe as radishes, but relatively small batches continually every about 3 weeks through the cycle and to keep you in constant production of arugula. Generally speaking, you can assume that from planting to harvest is about 5 weeks. I say about and advisedly because the later you do this into the late summer and fall, the slower that's going to be, the longer that interval from planting to harvest is going to be. That's a good ballpark to shoot for as you're looking at that. Arugula is usually hardy enough to overwinter without protection if you're just growing it as an overwintered crop for spring. If you want to winter harvest it, you're going to need to protect it a little bit, or it simply won't grow enough during that off season for you to have anything to harvest. But hardiness is quite good usually. Like all brassicas, they are prone to aphid problems. I don't know that I've ever had the root maggots on them. It seems to be primarily an aphid magnet rather than a fly magnet. Arugula is kind of a specialty case of a class of brassicas called broadly the mustards. There's a whole batch of different types of mustard greens. Most of the other mustards are not quite this hardy. If you're going to try to overwinter them for spring, you're probably going to be covering them to have really good success. They're also a little slower developing. Figure 6 weeks from planting to first harvest. So we plant basically July through September. Now, you certainly can plant mustards now for summer harvest. A lot of these crops bolt really readily if you do it right now. And arugula is in that category. Mustards are notoriously in that category. So we will often delay just a little bit starting to have better success later. So once we get past solstice and into the tail end of June, first part of July, that's really time to get started. Mustards are infamous for their aphid problems as well as beetle problems, so pay attention for those pests. Lettuce, we always think of as a main season crop, but it's actually one of the most adaptable leaf crops out there. Anything except the hottest part of the season is excellent lettuce growing. If you, again, start planting after the solstice, after we begin to see those shorter days and longer nights beginning, you can have a really good crops in small batches most of the winter. So last possible planting date from seed is probably very late September, very early October. Of course, you can transplant them a bit later. It's a soil temperature for germination limit. So you do need a good soil temperature for germination, but they will tolerate transplanting. It's surprisingly cold. And experimenting with this just because you can is fun. One year I threw lettuce seed out in the garden in January when I was doing pea seedings. I got lettuce, but I got less lettuce and later than the stuff I went through and planted in March. So yes, they will develop. They're very tough. The trick with lettuce really in these seasons is to avoid the heat. Timing is part of that, but also consider planting your lettuce or seeding your lettuce in the shade of taller plants. So at the edges of a corn row or adjacent to your tomatoes or pole beans, where they get some protection from the hottest sun. That will go a long way to having better success with these crops. They can overwinter, though they winter better with covers or protection. Technical hardiness is somewhere around 10 degrees. Slugs are a real problem on lettuce, especially head lettuces. Leaf lettuce is a little less so, but yeah, they're there. Plan on preventing your slugs rather than letting them get established. Kale is one of my favorite fall winter garden crops, and I say fall and winter, but I plant it in usually April or early May as part of my regular main season. Your kale will continue to produce through the summer, and you harvest it moderately outside and bottom leaves first. You'll continue to harvest into the fall, continue some light harvests over the winter, and then it pushes. In about February to early March, it starts pushing really aggressively again. Harvest a little faster because you're right on the end of it. By the end of March or first part of April, it's going to be flowering, and then you yank it out and throw it away. So it's a true biennial. It naturally goes through a wintering cycle before its reproductive cycle. And it makes it really easy crop to experiment with as a winter garden crop. Kale get aphids, kale get all kinds of caterpillars as well. So pay attention for insect control. If you have only caterpillars, you might consider using BT or spinosad insecticides instead of neem. Usually I have enough things going on at the same time in the garden. I just mix up a batch of neem and hit it all. Kale is very, very hardy here. Generally does not need any protection to get through the winter. Okay, a couple of crops I don't grow much of simply because they're not to my taste buds. Radicchio and Endive. Both of those can be seeded now or transplanted. A long window of available time for transplant. They do take a bit of time to develop out, so they do need be planted a little faster than mustards or arugula, for example. Radicchio and Endive are not super hardy, making them great fall crops, but challenging overwintering crops. So we don't get cold enough to freeze them out most years until like December. So you have a pretty good long window in there. They do have some insect and some slug sensitivities, as you might imagine. One of the fun things about Radicchio and Endive is that they're not in the main crop family, so they make good rotational plants. We'll talk about that in a couple of slides here, but they're actually sunflower composite family, not a brassica like so many things like that. Endive or endive, just because. So if you are planting and growing bunches of frilly greens with sharp flavor, you're growing endive. If you're growing it in the shade or half buried for a very mild, somewhat nutty flavored bud, you're growing Belgian endive. There are usually slightly different varieties involved as well, but that's the difference. All chicories, by the way, so that part of the aster composite family. So corn salad, champion overwintering crop, very easy to grow, plant seeds late. This is a great crop if you get behind. Plant seeds August through September for harvest in the winter and into the spring, 5-degree temperature range. Planted late, your insect and slug problems do decrease. Pay attention to the slugs, especially in the early part of the season, though. It's another fun plant that isn't related to anything else, so it makes a good crop rotation. It's actually in the honeysuckle family, the pepperfalls. Collards are yet another category of mustard family, brassica, which can be seeded, but are often done as transplant instead to get them further along. They take quite a while to be really mature, so that's one of the reasons transplants become the default approach. You can harvest, so collards planted May, June, you'll be harvesting late summer to fall. For my money, I wouldn't bother. They're not as good then. You do your plantings more like July into August, and you don't harvest till we've had a couple of good cold nights and a couple of frosts. The flavor will be a lot better. And that's what we target. So we typically will go through July or even August plantings ideally. Generally speaking, we expect collards to be reasonably hardy into the winter for winter harvest. They often do not overwinter unless sheltered, and there's not really, to my money, a great advantage to overwintering them. I'd rather have them available in the cold part of the winter at their peak flavor than later in the season. Spinach can be done as a main season crop. You can transplant spinach. We do that all the time. I know the gardening books say don't. The gardening books say don't for a reason. It's an incredibly sensitive plant with a relatively small root system when you're handling it. So lots of greens and very little roots. They don't transplant well. You have to be extraordinarily gentle with them, but they can be transplanted. I'll usually, when I'm doing a patch of spinach, I'll actually usually do a mix. I will plant some spinach from transplants, and then with good spacing, then I'll just seed some spinach in the interstitial spaces so I can have a kind of a continuous batch coming on. Typically, plantings done in July and August are fall harvest. If you get all the way out to the later part of August or September, you can try to either cover them for winter harvest, get enough size out to actually harvest something, or more commonly, and I do this with some regularity, simply grow them on as an overwintered crop. They will just kind of sit there as little baby plants, and then they'll develop out nicely in March. And that's a nice approach to handling. Swiss chard, so we're still in chennapods, by the way. Spinach, chard, beets are chennapods for crop rotation. Swiss chard is another one of those true biennial crops. You can follow all the instructions I give you here for on the slide here for fall plantings, but in practice, I usually just plant Swiss chard in the spring with my main season crop. I harvest through the spring, through the summer, through the fall, lightly into the winter, and chard doesn't hold up as well in the winter as far as production as kale does. A lot of times I don't get much chard after maybe the first week of December or so. But then it will push out a new spurt of heavy growth in February and harvest quite aggressively into March. And by the end of March, it's bolting. Once they see those flower stalks coming, get what you want off and get them out. You do that with Swiss chard. A lot of people don't do the overwintering with Swiss chard, and you take them out and you realize just how much of a beet they really are. They've got a massive tuber of a root system that goes very, very deep. So spinach and Swiss chard have the insect problems of beets minus the problems with a edible root crop. We don't worry too much about the soil insects typically, but they get leaf miner horribly. So especially with these summer plantings, good idea to use an insect barrier. You can use that as a preventative in practice because they have such long seasons. It's often common to, the moment you start seeing a problem, pluck every leaf that has any amount of leaf miner in it, and then throw a cover over that. Come back in 5 or 6 days, there'll be a few leaves that you didn't see any tunnels with the developed seeds. Get those out. But if you keep the cover over it for about 2 weeks, you've eliminated an entire generation basically of leaf miner, and then you'll have a nice growing window when they're not present. So there are a couple of legumes that can be grown, and they are overwintering crops usually. They're not the simplest. They're not for the faint of heart. They're not the simplest overwintering crops, but they can be done, and they give you some options in your growing cycle. So basically, fava beans. You can plant favas in the spring, but you have best success with favas planted in about September, later part of September, and then they'll harvest maybe June here. They are somewhat temperature sensitive, and because of their growth patterns, it's often not practical to cover them. They grow out like a cover crop. They grow out a fair amount of foliage from a September seeding, but they don't finish developing up their size and they're flowering out until the following year. Peas are much easier legume crop to play with as a fall winter crop. If you plant peas roughly now, for the next couple of weeks, you will have a fall harvest of peas, usually August, September, for me, sometimes into October. If you plant peas August, September, I've done it as late as early October, but I've never been really, really happy with the results, but maybe late August through middle or later September, you overwinter those peas and they harvest out in roughly March to April.
And that's if you seed when?
September, I would say anywhere from late August to late September is the window. You can freeze out peas, but they are hardier than favas, even though they're nominally listed for about 15 degrees. My experience has been favas are much more temperature sensitive than peas as a whole. It's not a good idea to do really big growing pole peas as an overwintered crop. They're brittle, they're fragile, they're kind of easily damaged by inclement weather. The smaller, shorter statured shelling or snow peas are usually a better option for you. I wouldn't bet the whole pea crop on this, but it gives you an option to have at least a few enjoyable peas in odd sections of the season, while still avoiding the peonation virus problems of hot weather. So that's the crops. We can talk a little bit about the technicals here. Timing, technique, and troubleshooting. So the most common problem, I want to emphasize this over and over again, nobody gets started fast enough, and they're coming to see me in late August, early September for their fall crops, and it's too late for most of the crops at that point. There's a few things you can do, but you're not going to be success. This is where we talk about numerical days. So you look at a catalog and they tell you got 38 days to harvest, 45 days to harvest. Those days are degree days. There's a mathematical model that compares your high for the day and your low for the day and comes up with a number. And then there's a mathematical process that gives you how many degree days that is, right? So I don't remember all the details. I look it up if I need it. But basically what that means is like mid-May through mid-June, day for day. A degree day is a day, basically. But on the shoulders of the season, both early and late, as we're getting into particularly late July, early August onward, it takes more than a day to make a degree day. Okay, because your temperatures are dropping off substantially at night. So what this means is these packages are best guidelines, and just keep in mind that it will not necessarily perform to those numerical specifications for that reason. We're not measuring calendar days, we're measuring degree days. Next most common problem we run into is not planning ahead enough. So we need to practice good crop rotations. We don't want to follow broccoli plants that we grew in the spring with broccoli plants that we're growing for fall, for example. And we have this alarming tendency, and I'm very guilty of this, is just cramming everything into the garden in May and June. And so you have no inches of space even for anything left because you're making the most use of your space. You have to plan ahead because your tomatoes and your peppers and your squashes are still there when you're growing your winter crops, your fall and winter crops. So allow space, plan ahead with space left behind during the spring plantings, intentionally plan for your fall crops, or that have really short turnover crops that you can follow up with fall and winter crops. Our weather during this period makes starting these plants much more challenging. And so typically you're irrigating your garden on a regular basis, fairly regular basis, you get into a rhythm on it. That means that areas where you're putting new plantings into that, whether it's from seed or transplant, you're going to be supplementally going out and hand watering or secondarily watering that separate from the rest of your main watering, because you just need more moisture on these young plants to keep them going, especially in this hot weather. And as we've said a couple of times, unfortunately, we're planting right in the peak of insect activity, so you have to pay more attention. It's not like it's per se worse, it's just you have less cushion for things to go from slightly wrong to disastrously wrong. Yeah. So here's kind of a schedule going through for the sequence here. So June, where we're at right now, you can be direct seeding beets, carrots. Endive takes time. It's a relatively slow crop. Radicchio as well. You're going to see a lot of these names repeated because they have a range of times you can do them. Parsnips, and don't delay on the parsnips, they take quite a long time, and Swiss chard. You can start your own transplants. In other words, if you don't want to buy commercial transplants, or you don't like the varieties offered in particular, you want your own things, this would be the timing in June to start your Brussels sprouts, broccoli, cabbage, cauliflower, collards, kale, the vast majority of the leaf and cole crops. Start them in seed trays in June for transplant. In 4 to 5 weeks for a lot of these, endive will be more like 6 weeks before it's ready to transplant typically. Things you can actually transplant in June for your crops. Well, Brussels sprouts for sure. Cabbage, particularly for fall harvest, you're pushing just a little early, but you could theoretically do it. Collards, yes, they take that long. Kale, yes, they're a true biennial. Swiss chard, lettuce, all quite doable as continuous harvest crops transplanted. We get into July, we still have a lot of things where it can be direct seeding. Beets, these are root crops in particular in July, after we've avoided the worst of the scorch. Beets and carrots, rutabagas and turnips, parsnips, the very end of your parsnip seeding. Peas seeded in July will harvest in the fall still. You still do mustards of all types and collards and such. Yes.
When you say start your own, you mean versus seed?
Yes. So when we say seed on the chart, where you're seeding in the ground, we say start your own. You're planting seed in 6-packs or cells to transplant later. It's really not. While we have dates assigned for seeding broccoli, for example, the success rate for direct seeding broccoli is so low. There's so many disease organisms that affect those. So instead, we choose to transplant. We use that seeding date as your start seed indoors for transplant later date. So that's kind of what we're looking at there. So if you're planning on starting your own broccoli for transplant in about 5 weeks, you should be doing it now, so you have it available for like late July transplants. Right? So starting your own seed, still got plenty of time for endive, radicchio, collards, lettuce, and mustards, really commonly done in July for transplant later. You're actually transplantable the vast majority of your leaf and cole crops by July. Broccoli, Brussels sprouts, cabbage. Mid-July on is regular sequence for fall, winter, or overwintering, depending on varieties picked. No harm in transplanting kale and Swiss chard this late. I like to do it earlier to maximize the use of those individual plants, but you still got plenty of window of time to do it. August, we're starting to really taper off what you can do. By August, you're really not starting your own transplants anymore at all. You still have quick maturing things or things that are fairly simple to do from seed, or things that don't like to start near the solstice. So you direct seed beets and carrots still with good success. Arugula can be direct seeded now if you don't like to transplant it. Corn salad can be direct seeded, usually about the end of the month. No, I don't usually go much earlier than that. Lettuce, mustards. Onions from seed would be July into August.
And you're talking about seed.
In the ground. Yep. Yep.
Never tried it.
Yep.
but it's-
I've done it a couple of times. I usually either buy 6-packs or start 6-packs for seed, or do bunches in the spring. It's really is the best way to handle onions, to be honest. Radishes, you got plenty of time to finish a radish crop. Spinach, turnips, yes. Rutabagas, maybe early August. I've done them that late. I find that if I get much later than the first week of August by seeding rutabagas, I'm pretty unhappy with the results. So. It really is the cutoff, but you can transplant rutabagas in August very well. All your pole crops, pretty much all of your leaf crops are still going for transplant. Okay, so what happens later than August? Not a lot. Arugula through September, no problem. Maybe early October. Corn salad, September and October are ideal. Habas, September and October. Peas for overwintering, September and October. Overwinter, didn't make it on the list. Overwintering carrots, specific varieties for overwintering, September, October. Garlic from bulbs, onion set bulbs are September, October. Radishes, yeah, September. You'll still get a crop usually. Sometimes you freeze out that crop if you get significantly later into September. And still a lot of options for transplants, but it's a lot of the same crops: endive, lettuce, seedling onions that somebody started for you, or you started your own. So getting this all off to a good start. Watering, it is the biggest challenge really with the season, is keeping nice, consistent, even moisture during the germination stages or during the early transplant stages. Usually means hand watering in addition to regular irrigation. Pay attention to what your soil is doing, figure out its rhythms, and pay attention to weird hot spells and particularly windy spells. The wind often has more impact on how much water you're losing than the absolute temperature. Remember the crop families and practice good rotation. That's our next slide. We'll look at the crop families briefly. Plan ahead, not only during your main planting season for the fall crop, but as you're doing fall and winter crop plantings, think about that space and what you're planning to grow there next year. Some of these crops don't finish out until March, April, or June, July in the case of onions and garlic. So that space is occupied during a big chunk of your main season. If you know you're going to be planting a batch of broccoli in the spring, you don't want to have cabbage in that soil, even if it's harvested out in the fall or winter because of the disease pressure. So rotations matter. Your soil is compacted and depleted, even if you worked it this spring. So rework it, re-amend as necessary, depending on your soil quality. I like to work compost into mine because I'm on native clay soils. It's a little challenging sometimes, but add fertilizer. It's not there. Even if you manure it heavily and you fertilize the whole garden bed in the spring, it's depleted. You need to refresh it. So here are your major crop families. There's other things in the spring cycle, and some of the plants on here are your spring summer cycle plants, just so you know what fits in there. So brassicas are, of course, all the broccoli, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, cabbages. The greens crops are arugula, collards, kale, all the mustards. The root crops, radishes, rutabagas, and turnips. The vast majority of what you can grow fall, winter, and overwintered are brassicas, and you need to pay attention to that one specifically. The chennapods are your beets, spinach, Swiss chard, and in the summer, quinoa is a chennapod as well. There's a couple other things you see from time to time. Those are the common ones. Your umbellifers, your parsley family. So parsley, parsnips, dill, carrots. They exhibit quite an affinity for certain diseases and quite an affinity for insect pests. So practice good rotations there. Your legumes are peas and beans, also clover and vetch and cover crops. Be aware of that. So your composites, this is your sunflower family. Sunflowers, lettuces, endive, radicchio, all the chicories are composites. Your alliums are what you might expect: garlic, onions, shallots, chives, leeks. Only thing in Capra Falls, corn salad, it is an obscure one. It's weird. Now there's no nightshades in your fall and winter crop, as you might imagine. They're mostly tropical, subtropical group of plants. So they make the natural other end of the cycle for fall and winter gardening. The challenge is it's easy to go from winter harvest cauliflower, even overwintering cauliflower, which comes out in March or April, and still plant your tomatoes. But where your tomatoes are, you can't, your tomatoes are still there when you need to be planting those crops, which means I tend to use potatoes. Potatoes are usually, I use a lot of short season potatoes, 60 and 70-day potatoes. My potatoes are coming out right about in time for a lot of these brassica crops to go in. So keep them growing healthy, fertilize well at planting, supplement if they're not moving along fast enough, or for crops that have particularly high nutrient demands with liquid fertilizers. The period between a roughly mid to late September and roughly the end of February, granular organic fertilizers are relatively ineffective. Liquid feed in those periods instead. We have a number of pest issues that happen pretty heavily, so monitor regularly and don't assume that just because you got them a couple of weeks ago that they're not back. Aphids are a huge problem in so many crops. Slugs are a nasty problem, and the specific pests, the leaf miners on the chennapods and the maggots on the crucifers and on the carrots and parsnips, can cause you whole entire crop failures if you're not catching them. So take the preventive steps on those pests specifically. Bear in mind that this season is less forgiving than the spring season. So if you've got plants that are sickly and struggling and constantly insect infested, get them out before you spend more energy on them, before they spread their problems to nearby plants. Less hardy plants, we've talked about several of them. Covers of some form. So we talked about insect barrier, which is a mild temperature cover as well. They make a heavier duty version of this, Remay, Fleece, other brands, that provide several degrees of winter insulation on the minimum temperature end. They're very useful for providing a little bit of protection. If you need a little bit more protection, we usually run up to some form of a sheet plastic, whether it's pre-built hoops, like the ones here, or whether you're creating your own semi-rigid structures. Remay and insect barrier can drape over the top of any plant that is strong enough to not be weighted down by them. There's no downside to the fabric being in contact with the plant. Plastic films create a freeze problem where the plastic contacts a plant. So they need to be propped up off the plants entirely. So that's a big difference to keep intact. Remade fabrics and other similar fabrics breathe a bit. These plastic films don't. Humidity can get very high. Also, during freak weather events, like we suddenly hit 90 degrees in April, they become an oven, where Remay at least breathes a little bit. So be aware of the limitations of those products specifically for any given crop you're working with. So I realize that, not everybody's done this, and some people put a lot of stress on their failures, and others just learn from them. But here are some good options if you want to play with this without getting too buried into it and getting yourself in trouble with things that aren't working well. Kale and Swiss chard, you're already probably growing them. Just continue to harvest them lightly instead of destructive harvesting them through the season. And you can continue harvesting fall, winter, and even into the next spring. They're the simplest crop to practice winter gardening. Onions and garlic are really the only way to do them well is as an overwintered crop. So if you're growing them at all, you're probably already familiar with them. They're good choices because the degree of success varies, but we seldom hit the point of abject failure in those crops. Corn salad and arugula, they have less possible things that go wrong with them, and they're more cold tolerant than just about any other greens crop. So they're a good introductory greens crop. And then the fall harvest end of the broccoli, cauliflower, and cabbage, because the later you get into the season, the more things that can go wrong with them. Usually if you focus on the earlier maturing varieties for fall harvest, you'll have your first taste of success with those crops as a fall crop. That's what I had for you guys today. I would take any questions from the audience or any questions from the online audience as well.
Go ahead, you go.
So you talked about nematodes, and the nematodes
Yes.
control for aphids?
Yeah, so nematodes. So nematodes are used as a pre-plant or can be used post-plant. They're a biological. So we're talking about beneficial nematodes, and they control the larval stages of insects. They're not very effective on aphids. They're effective on things that have a soil-dwelling larval stage primarily. So if you have a lot of wireworm problems, you have a lot of root maggot problems, other root insect problems. Cutworms, they're very effective as a preventative for cutworm. They do some beetles as well, but not all beetles. And remember, beetles fly effectively, so you can control all your larval beetles all you want, but your neighbor's beetles are going to find you. So they're not as good a control in that degree. So they're kind of expensive per square foot treated, but they're a good biological approach to controlling soil insects specifically. Other than that, you resort to primarily synthetic pyrethroids like bifenthrin. We used to use, back in the day, the bad old days, we used to use things like Dursban and diazinon granules directly into the soil as a pre-plant treatment. Okay, you don't do that anymore. Those are now restricted use pesticides. But we still have some relatively milder insecticides you can do that with as a pre-plant treatment. So it's not things you do after the vegetables are growing, it's prior to planting.
So
Nematodes versus neem oil, they're different things.
right,
Yeah,
yeah, nematodes?
Nematodes, they're
Oh.
microscopic flatworms, nematode.
Oh, so are you getting, yeah, I see, I've got nematodes. So anyway, I'll get it later. So those you put in at the beginning or?
You can do them as a pre-plant treatment so nematodes you can do as a pre-plant treatment if you know you're fighting constant problems with soil insects. They're a biological, so they have some persistence. They have a little bit of motility. They move around. They can also be used drenched in if you're starting to have problems, but you think it's still solvable, right? By the time you notice root maggot problems, to be honest with you, the chances of salvaging those crops are minimal. But the crops next to them might be a few days not so far along, but still having problems. So like if I get a planting of cauliflower out there and I got a plant, see it wilting down, we know it's a root maggot problem almost immediately. Go out there and pull it, yep, got maggots in there. I throw that plant away, but then I drench the rest of the row with nematodes or with neem. Neem doesn't have the duration of control, but it gives us some. Or with spinosad, another organic insecticide. They give you a chance of finishing those crops, but not the one that's already so massively infested.
Yeah, they're not gonna save anything.
They're not going to save anything except things that are just barely getting started. By the time you see symptoms, it's pretty well along.
And so then do they reproduce and stay in?
Nematodes reproduce and stay in the soil depending on soil temperature and moisture. They do die out in the winter and they do die out if they get dried out in the summer. So in irrigated spots, they persist through the summer, and we lose most of them over the winter. We have what we figure we redo.
You can see.
No, can't see nematodes without a microscope. Not even a magnifying glass. There's you get a little sponge, an agar sponge that you soak them off of onto water to apply. There's approximately 10 million in a spot like that. Microscopic. Got a question online. As a beginner, can I grow garlic and onions in pots? Yes, there's some other, a lot of the leaf crops can be grown in pots as well. Garlic and onions can be grown in pots. You do need to pay attention to moisture levels a little bit more because pots aren't necessarily holding water as much as the natural soil does. You can do like long window boxes are easy to do both of those in. If you're doing round pots, if you're doing small round pots, it's like one plant per pot up to like 8 to 10 inches or so. If you do large tree pots, like the 25-gallon pots, 17, 18 inches across, you can do a fair amount of garlic or onions in there. You still want to practice really good spacings. In fact, maybe a little more obsessive about spacings in a container than I would be in the ground. So if we're taking crops we're thinning to 4 to 6 inches, you might be more like 6 to 8 inches. And space them away from the sides, because the side transition area is not good for growing. But it is absolutely possible to do garlic and onions in containers.
Knotted and carrots, you said there was a reason for the gnarly and the hairy one?
Yeah, so gnarly, hairy carrots. What causes, there's a few things that can happen that can cause carrots to deform. Cloddy soil rather than fine soil will cause them to usually bend and wiggle and sometimes fork, like that's basically singleton forks. Too much fresh organic mass, compost that's not finished decomposing in the soil, will cause them to grow weird root structures, not just bifurcated, but multi-legged roots, and some hairiness. Too much available nitrogen will cause them to be hairy. Too much moisture for too long will cause them to either get rubbery or hairy, depending on the variety. So if you're overwintering carrots or you're ground storing carrots, drainage does become a factor. This is a real problem for me in my wet clay soils out northeast Corvallis. Yes, I can overwinter carrots. I actually had a decent overwinter crop this year, but some years they fail almost entirely because it ends up underwater too much.
Would you cover them?
I don't normally need to cover them. It's rather the other end. It's the soil moisture.
Oh,
My water table, my soil description says my water table is from 1 inch below the soil surface to 2 inches over the top.
Yeah, that's my
Even in a raised garden, slightly elevated garden, the carrots are down there about 10 to 12 inches. So it can be a problem.
And you mentioned the thinning, to do that is, at what point, how big are the carrots?
Okay, so thinning carrots and thinning parsnips. First thing you get is 2 seed leaves. They look almost like grass. Then you start getting true leaves out. At 2 true leaves out the center, do your first thinning. And then you'll want to check them basically once a week for the next 2 or 3 weeks until you finish out to a decent spacing.
And what kind of spacing do you?
So parsnips and carrots are slightly different. Parsnips need more space. Carrots, I like to be thinning down to about a 2 to 3 inch spacing. Parsnips, you really should be around 4.
4 inches?
A little more wouldn't hurt, but 4 you can get away with.
I never, I'm good with carrots. I've never been able to pick parsnips.
My dad does a phenomenal job with parsnips, and he spends all winter trying to give them away because nobody in the family really likes them that well. So,
Like them in things.
in things, yeah, that's what you do with them. You stew them or whatever. And I mean, they can be good. I've had good parsnips. I've had the best parsnips I've had is when I do mixed roasted roots. So I throw them in with sweet potatoes and all kinds of other roots and just slow cook them with some, either I'll go savory with cumin or I'll go with a honey glaze for sweeter. That's great, but that's about the only way I eat parsnips, really.
And you said you could add sandy loam.
Sandy loam is a good amendment that doesn't have so much organic mass in it, so it's not going to give you the weird root formations. Carrots like sand, but you don't want to plant carrots in straight sand because their tubers don't go through straight sand very well. You need the blended soils.
Okay.
So yeah, sandy loam is a good amendment and it can be used also as a top dress for your seed.
Okay, great. Thank you.
That's not something that you guys sell.
Actually, we do. Our bags, premium topsoil is a sandy loam with a little bit of compost.
Primary premium?
Premium topsoil. Bag gardener. Other than that, you hit the bulk soil places for that. Yeah.
Okay, so this is maybe a little bit tangential for this talk, but it relates to starting transplants. During the winter, I do it in the house, but I have a porch that is it gets warm under there. So I'm wondering about starting full crops.
Okay, excellent question. And not tangential, it really is relevant for this talk. Okay, starting transplants. There are upper and lower temperature threshold limits, right? So in the winter, when you're starting stuff inside, you're trying to make sure you're staying warm enough for good germination. So 55 to 70 degrees is considered those nominal ranges for germination for most vegetable crops. On the summer end, it's often the other end of that. And you can certainly start them inside just like normal because your household temperatures are within a fine range. But if you want to start them outside, that's fine. Just you need to pay attention. And again, my father's a heck of a gardener, taught vocational ag for years. He created himself a new a seedling bed. And so instead of doing it in little cells, he actually has a small raised bed that he starts everything in and then plucks them out to transplant rather than growing them in cells, right? Another option. So it's an artificial soil bed. So he can do it just like the saying, right? He made it out of pretty small and out of too dark a material. And it's been overheating to the point his brassicas don't sprout right. So once you start getting your soil temperatures pushing much above 75 in the 80s, it's over.
Yeah, that was.
So control that temperature as well as moisture during those phases. But yeah, you certainly can do it outside. It's actually often easier to for these crops. Yeah.
So keep it under 75.
Keep it under 75 is ideal. I mean, you can creep up into the 80, and again, that's soil temperature, not air temperature, and that's a little harder to read sometimes.
Okay, soil.
Yeah. I think your finished death point is there's charts online if you ever want to look any of this up, because I doing this from memory. I was thinking was your death point I think is 95, but anything much into the 80s is risky. You have really poor performance. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Absolutely, thanks. Very good. Well, I'll let you go from there. You guys know where to find me. If you got any follow-up questions, we will be posting this talk online on our YouTube channel like usual. So it'll be probably a week or so before they get it rendered and posted. But if you want to review it, it'll be there. Thank you very much.
Thank you.